a classic sound. Why do I say that, you ask? Well, there's a reason for that, because today is the 20th anniversary of the original Xbox.
The original Xbox. Man, there's so much to say about this console, I don't even know where to start. Back in 1998, the Xbox was in the works at PC company Microsoft, who wanted to play their hand in the console industry. So Kevin Bacus, Seamus Blackley, Otto Burks, and Ted Hayes came together and made the console, with Bill Gates giving them the go-ahead. In its early stages, the Xbox was originally called the Direct Xbox, and as a console made by one of the most well-known computer companies in the world, was created to work like a PC. During its development process, the Xbox was created to run on Windows 2000, which not only was one of the most advanced operating systems at the time, at least for the year 2000, but it also made it easier for developers to make games for the console and its hardware. Not only that, but the processing power the console had made it run faster and perform better than the PS2 and GameCube, making games run smoother, the pixelation was nicer, and the graphics were better on a number of games, whether they were first party or third party. So yeah, the Xbox was pretty ambitious from Microsoft and its development team with everything they were putting into it. Then came the year 2000 when Microsoft first introduced the console at the Game Developers Conference, with Bill Gates discussing the console and showcasing the system specs, having an internal storage hard drive for games rather than relying on memory cards, although that was still optional, save data, music, and other medias, and of course one of the biggest things, the potential and capabilities for online play. The online play was a big thing because the only other console that had online play capabilities was the Dreamcast, which despite only lasting 2 years, was also part of the 6th generation. Around 1 year later, after being first revealed at the Game Developers Conference, the final design of the Xbox was revealed at the 2001 Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas, being presented by Bill Gates and Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. That's right, championship wrestler and actor Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson helped present the video game console. I remember seeing this on TV with my dad at the time and thought this was the coolest thing ever. That same year of November 15th, 2001, the Xbox saw a full release in North America along with launch titles such as Fusion Frenzy, Oddworld Munch's Odyssey, Tony Hawk Pro Skater 2X, Shrek, Project Gotham Racing, Dead or Alive 3, and many others in addition to Halo Combat Evolved, the poster child game of the console. Now as stated in my Star Wars The Clone Wars review, my family didn't get the OG Xbox until Christmas of 2003, but even before that I was already early into gaming, playing games on my family's computer and the Super Nintendo, but when we got the Xbox, that's where everything changed. Ever since we got the Xbox, my dad, sister, and I, and even my friends back in Georgia had made so many memories playing together. Many nights of two-player games and renting games from our local video store for more experiences.
The 6th generation of gaming had so many fun and amazing titles, and growing up an Xbox kid, I got to play so many great games and made so many memories from them. So, to celebrate the Xbox's 20th anniversary, I thought I'd take you down a trip down memory lane and showcase some of the games that I played from my childhood to my teenage years to now, and even showcase some underrated titles that not many people have heard of.
Now I can't talk about the OG Xbox without talking about the two games of the series that made the console famous, Halo Combat Evolved and its sequel. Now I wasn't too into Halo when I was a kid. I thought it was cool when I watched my dad play it, and we also played the co-op mode together, but it wasn't really my thing at the time. I didn't get fully into the Halo series until my teenage years during 8th grade, and I was amazed at what I missed out on. With its story and lore, fun gameplay, and fantastic soundtrack, Combat Evolved paved the way for a new series of games that would last generations, and back then was the game that was said to be the reason to buy an Xbox. Although the first game is regarded as the pioneer of the series and is still loved today, the series made a huge hit with its sequel Halo 2. With updated visuals, its soundtrack that even beats the first games, new weapons, and an amazing story that would lead into the next generation. This is also how I was introduced to Breaking Benjamin as a kid. Not only that, but this time around, at certain points of the game, you also get to experience the story from the Covenant's point of view, playing as the Arbiter, a former Sangheili Supreme Commander by the name of Thel 'Vadamee, who after failing to protect the Halo from the first game, was stripped of his rank and became the Covenant Prophet's next Arbiter, a rank bestowed to heretics, and sent on suicide missions for the sake of the Covenant. The fact that you got to not only play as an elite, but also experience the story from the antagonist protagonist's point of view was such a big deal at the time. Not only that, but this was the first Halo game that introduced online multiplayer. Everything that Halo 2 delivered is what makes this game considered to be the best game in the series for a lot of fans, and the best-selling Xbox game of the generation, with 8.46 million copies sold as of 2008. These two games would then get the remastered treatment, with them being released subtitled as Anniversary, with the first game being released on the 360 and later the Xbox One, and the second game also being released on the Xbox One via the Master Chief Collection, with revamped graphics and the same fun. Halo became a beloved series over the years that expanded to books, films, comics, and even an upcoming series for Paramount Plus, and I can't wait for Halo Infinite in December. The series itself also turns 20 years old today. Can you believe it? Happy 20th birthday, Halo. I'll be rocking out to the Mjolnir mix on Infinite's release day. Next up, I thought I'd talk about another Xbox exclusive series which I played the hell out of as a kid. Blinx the Time Sweeper was a platformer game where you play as an anthropomorphic cat named Blinx, who is part of a time control group known as the Time Sweepers, whose duty is to keep the flow of time controlled, but after a gang of time stealers known as Tom-Toms disrupted the flow of time in one of the worlds, it is up to Blinx to restore the world. Now this game is definitely an underrated classic. It's one of those games that's weird to look at but fun to play. The fact that you can use time as an actual mechanic in this game, rewinding, forwarding, pausing, and even recording yourself so a clone can mimic your actions to help solve puzzles and progress is something you don't really see a lot of in games nowadays. This is a game I recommend everyone I meet who has never played it if they're looking for something new. I would talk about its sequel Blinx 2 Masters of Time and Space, but the thing is, I never actually played the sequel as a kid. The only time I played this game was just recently for the retrospective. I will say from what I've seen, I do like the idea of character customization and the option to play as a time sweeper or even a Tom-Tom, the antagonists from the first game. The game also has a co-op mode as well, something that the previous game didn't have. Maybe when I get around to reviewing these games in the future, I'll go more into detail on them, especially the second game. Blinx was also meant to be Xbox's mascot, rivaling Nintendo's Mario and Sega's Sonic, but because the sequel was overshadowed by Halo 2, which came out literally a week before Blinx 2, don't know what the hell they were thinking in the first place there, Blinx sadly became a victim to the flow of time and was forgotten over the years, leaving Master Chief to be Xbox's unofficial mascot. Next is Forza Motorsport. Now I'm not a big fan of racing games unless they're like Mario Kart, and I do like the Need for Speed games, but Forza Motorsport is a pretty popular racing series on the Xbox, rivaling PlayStation's Gran Turismo. The graphics look great at the time and still hold up, not to mention that the driving controls were smooth, and the series is still going on today, with a whole variety of cars and a bunch of different racetracks. Definitely a game to get if you love racing or just looking at cars in general. Next up is MechAssault and its sequel Lone Wolf. MechAssault was the first game in the BattleTech MechWarrior series that I ever played, and this game is what introduced me to my love for mech-related games and mech-related media. This was a game I rented from my local video store a lot back in the day. You weren't a foot soldier taking on grunts in an antagonistic faction, no. You were a pilot for heavily armed war machines known as battlemechs. Each mech you pilot has their own strengths and weaknesses, and each ones have their own awesome styles of combat and variety of abilities. Its sequel, Lone Wolf, introduced new mechs to pilot in addition to new gameplay mechanics such as actually leaving your mech so you can enter another in the middle of battle. And from what I've heard from fans who played these games back in the day, the multiplayer for these were insane too, with different game modes and variety in multiplayer. Definitely games I'll look at on the channel in the future. Next up is Crimson Skies, High Road to Revenge, and if you're a fan of dogfighting games, this is definitely a game for you. With over 12 fighter crafts to play as, with different strengths and weaknesses and variety of different weaponry along with its addicting arcade-style gameplay and story, this game has definitely aged well, especially considering how they developed this game to work in different ways with the use of the analog sticks on the controllers. Now I can't talk about Xbox without talking about its cult classic Stubs the Zombie and Rebel Without a Pulse. Developed by Wideload, this game was made with the Halo engine because it had some of the developers of the original Halo games at the time work on this. Now picture this, it's 2005 and a new game gets released called Stubs the Zombie, a game where you play as a zombie.
A zombie? You mean the enemies we've been fighting in video games for generations?
That's right, this time the roles are reversed. You play as a zombie in a futuristic 1950s setting, and you can do everything you expect a zombie to do. Devour brains, start your own zombie infestation, fart, wait. fart is an attack power in this game? How is this not Game of the Year at the time? The game later developed a cult following over the years and demanded high prices on eBay both for Xbox and PC. Thankfully, this game rose from the dead and has been given love on the modern day consoles. Now we can't forget Fusion Frenzy, can we? Now back in the 6th generation when it came to party games, if you weren't playing Mario Party, you were most likely playing Fusion Frenzy. And although my friends and I at the time had a blast playing both, Fusion Frenzy was still a blast every time we played it. Minus when we would break out into a fight. This is definitely a game you should get to play with friends. The mini games are fun and it's great for game nights or hosting party events. This is a game I'd love to see get a revival at some point. It's heavily underrated. Then we've got Armed and Dangerous. I played this game around my teenage years and let me tell you something. I don't think I've ever played a game that made me laugh so hard before, especially a game made by LucasArts. For one thing, there's so many different references. There's Star Wars references, Lord of the Rings references, hell, there's even Monty Python references. The jokes in this game are so funny too. Some are kind of dated, but still good for a chuckle. The shoot-'em-up style gameplay is addicting as hell too, and you get a variety of weapons and equipment. You even get a gun that shoots out sharks to eat your enemies. Tell me that's not crazy for a game like this. Actually, if you think that's crazy, look at this.
I didn't know they had kidneys.
If you're looking for a comedic video game that doesn't take itself seriously, then this is the game. It's another game that makes me miss the 6th generation for its wackiness and variety. Next up is Jet Set Radio Future, another game I rented the crap out of at my local video store. Now I didn't get to play the original Jet Set Radio, or Jet Grind Radio as it was called in North America at the time of its year 2000 release, until my teenage years on the Xbox 360 through Xbox Live Arcade. But I had my fill with its 2002 sequel. I don't think I've ever played a roller skating game this addicting before. Going around the city roller skating, grinding on rails, performing tricks and spraying graffiti, and completing certain objectives going against a corporation, all while avoiding the police, really screams early 2000s.
Aren't video games amazing? Back when I was a kid, if we did stuff like this in real life, we would get juvenile records. But you can do it in this game and still have a blast doing it.
This game's art style, music, and gameplay really makes it stick out from other Xbox games and was later bundled with the Xbox bundle packs along with Sega GT 2002, with the standalone version of the game demanding high prices online. Kind of sad that it wasn't commercially successful for Sega. Although Jet Set Radio has now become a victim to the flow of time with no new release for the series even though it deserves another entry, its legacy will continue with its upcoming spiritual successor, Bomb Rush Cyberpunk. So it's nice to see that the series will continue in some way. Next up, we've got Dead or Alive, with Ultimate 1 and 2 and one of the Xbox's launch titles, Dead or Alive 3. Now if you want addicting fighting games in your collection, then these are the games for you. Along with the Dragon Ball Z Budokai games back in the day, Dead or Alive 3 was a fighting game that I played a lot with my friends back in Georgia, with a variety of characters to play as with unique movesets. Not only that, but with unrestricted 3D axis movements and increased counter periods. It's a great game for beginners of the series, but I don't know if it would be considered a good game for beginners in fighting games, especially with the newer fighting games nowadays being made for fast-paced competitive gameplay. And with the power capabilities of the Xbox, it pushed the range of the game's graphics and sizes of the stage, not to mention the enhanced pixelation. And with the Xbox's analog buttons and its pressure sensitivity function, it allowed shortcuts for certain moves. This is a great function for players new to the series. A few years later, the first two entries in the series would also get the Xbox treatment, with Dead or Alive Ultimates 1 and 2 being part of a compilation, with Ultimate 1 being a high-resolution version of the Sega Saturn version of the first game, and Ultimate 2 being an enhanced remake of Dead or Alive 2, which utilized the same graphics engine as Extreme Beach Volleyball and even had the game mechanics of 3. It also introduced new content and an additional character, Hitomi, and it's even got Aerosmith's Dream On as the intro song. Now after talking about Dead or Alive, I can't neglect to talk about its spin-off series, Ninja Gaiden. Although the Ninja Gaiden series first started off on the arcade and NES as a side-scroller, this Ninja Gaiden marked the series' first time in the 3D action-adventure world and took place in the Dead or Alive series as a spin-off featuring characters such as, of course, the main protagonist of the original games, Ryu Hayabusa, in addition to Ayane and Helena. I picked up this game during my freshman year of college. Now you want a game that's fun and addicting, but such a challenge that you could potentially pull your hair out and break a few controllers, then this is the game for you. If you thought Dark Souls was one of the hardest games ever released, least, you haven't played Ninja Gaiden. This game shows no remorse and will test your reflexes and your wit, and you will die over and over and over again. But it's not impossible. All it takes is a lot of practice and learning curves, and once you master it, the game is one of the most fun and addicting games with some of the smoothest combat you'll ever play. Team Ninja would then release an updated version of the game titled Ninja Gaiden Black, and to me, this is the true version of the game to play. In addition to including the DLC you could previously purchase in the original version, Black includes new weapons, new modes, new costumes, new difficulties, several new in-game cutscenes, and differences in gameplay and enemies depending on what difficulty you play on. Not only that, but they've also reworked the enemy AI to be more aggressive and adaptive than they were in the original version, and at times, you'll have to find other ways to overcome foes. But it does remove a few things from the original, but that's a story for another time. The game also includes an emulation of the original Ninja Gaiden game, but depending on what version you have, will include a different version of the original, with the vanilla version including the NES game and Black including the arcade game. This game also wasn't afraid to push the limits of the Xbox and is still one of the most visually pleasing and smoothest playing Xbox games to date. It also spawned 2 sequels during the Xbox 360 era and ports of the first and second game on the PS3 subtitled Sigma and Sigma Plus on the Vita. Next up is Oddworld: Stranger's Wrath, a spin-off of the Oddworld series released in 2005. In Stranger's Wrath, you play as the titular stranger in a western-like setting in the Oddworld universe. You're a bounty hunter looking to make money for a life-saving operation, fighting against outlaws of the West. One of the most well-known mechanics of this game is the function of live rounds, small creatures in the game that work as ammo and all have different functions. The characters and tone is something you would usually expect in an Oddworld game, and it definitely has its fair share of humor. Even if you haven't played any of the games in the Oddworld series, Stranger's Wrath is definitely a game to play if you want to get introduced to this series, because there's no Abe or Munch or Glucons or Moticons or even Rapture Farms. In fact, to my recollection, there's no mention of any of these in this game. It's a spin-off game with its own story and setting without any confusion in the series. An updated HD version of the game is also available on PC, PS3, and Switch. Now, since I brought up Stranger's Wrath, I might as well talk about Munch's Odyssey. Or I would, but for some reason my copy doesn't work. I guess this will be for a future video. Now to talk about some games developed by Rare after they become a first-party developer for Microsoft. It By The Ghoulies is a game I have fond memories with, and a game that should be played if you haven't even heard of it until now. The cartoony art style, goofy characters, and fun gameplay really makes it stick out as a Rare title and is one of their most underrated games. Up next in Rare's original Xbox game list is Conkers Live and Reloaded, a 2005 remaster of Conkers Bad Fur Day from the Nintendo 64, with updated graphics for the Xbox. Now this was a game that as a kid I saw at Blockbuster numerous times and thought it was a kid's game, but then I noticed the blood on the bayonet on the cover and the M rating, so I wasn't allowed to rent it. I didn't hear about the game until years later during my early teenage years when I came across gameplay of Bad Fur Day and Live and Reloaded on YouTube. That's when I finally found a copy for the Xbox. Everything from the original version was there: the violence, the movie references, the toilet humor, everything. Although some parts of the game were altered and most of the seriously bad words such as shit and fuck are censored, even though fuck was the only word that was censored in the 64 game. But even then, you're playing Bad Fur Day with a visually updated coat of paint. Live and Reloaded also introduced a multiplayer mode that was different from the original. It was mainly a third-person military-like shooter with a class-based gameplay system with somewhat of its own story, and also included online multiplayer support through Xbox Live. The multiplayer also has bots, so you can still play it. If you have trouble finding the original physical 64 copy, then Live and Reloaded is the next best thing. Finally, moving on from Rare, we have the first Fable game. Now this may come as a shock to a lot of you, but growing up as an Xbox kid, I never played Fable during my childhood despite all my friends at school talking about it. I wasn't interested in RPGs until my preteen years, but I didn't even play Fable until my early years of college. But considering that there's a new Fable game in development, I thought I'd give this a spot in the video. Honestly, I'm kinda sad I missed out on this, considering I was a fan of fantasy-related media growing up. This game practically has you play as the hero in the world you would hear from bedtime stories that your grandparents would tell you when you were a kid. You got to do heroic duties, meet comrades along the way, and build up your character to be the ultimate warrior. There was also a morality system in this game as well, and depending on what actions you do, good or bad, affects your character, your appearance, your reputation, and even the people around you. This game would then be expanded with Fable: The Lost Chapters, an expansion that includes the original game along with extra content that wasn't in the original game. So if you didn't have enough Fable the first time around, you'll be bound to get even more in The Lost Chapters. This game got the anniversary treatment back in 2014 with a remastered edition on the Xbox 360 that included all of the extra content from The Lost Chapters.
Oof, now that I got most of the exclusives out of the way, at least the ones that I've played, let's look at a few third-party and non-exclusive games that I played on the original Xbox.
Now first up is CounterStrike. This was the first game I did for my Let's Look At series on my channel. Now I know that some of the games that were Xbox exclusives at the time were also released on PC earlier. The Xbox version of CounterStrike was just a port of the PC version, which was released a few years later, so I personally don't consider it an exclusive the same way Halo and Stubs were despite them being on PC. But regardless, despite the fact that the Xbox was the only console that this game was ported to, it was nice for Xbox players to experience a game like CounterStrike at the time with the use of Xbox Live. Although many would consider the Xbox version to be an inferior port to the original PC version, which included more content than what the Xbox version had, the latter version is still a nice cheap game to play as a time waster with AI bots. Speaking of first-person shooters, I felt it necessary to include Time Splitters 2 into the mix. If you loved playing GoldenEye 64 back in the day, you'll love playing this. When I was a kid, this was a game one of my buddies would bring over and we would have a blast playing the story and multiplayer. Very few first-person shooter games nowadays are as addicting as this, not to mention having an interesting story. Although I would play the other Time Splitters games later on, Time Splitters 2 is still considered one of my favorite FPS games of all time. Fun fact, in the game Homefront: The Revolution, you can actually play a full version of Time Splitters 2. Just talking about Time Splitters makes me excited for Time Splitters 4. Continuing with the first-person genre in my collection is Delta Force Black Hawk Down. Now growing up in a military family, my dad loved playing games involving shooters, and we both used to play Delta Force 2 on the computer together back then, but this game we both had a blast playing as well. The game is still visually pleasing and another fun military shooter. Now every time I play this game, I think of the weekends when we would play this with a big plate of nachos in between us. And even though we never played the multiplayer back then, it was still apparently pretty big, especially on the Xbox. 50 players a match on Xbox? That was insane at the time. Another game I enjoyed watching my dad play was Soldier of Fortune 2 Double Helix. Later on, I played the game as I got older and I understood the real gameplay concepts of the game. Being a sequel to the first game released on the Dreamcast, PS2, and PC, the sequel was first released on PC in 2002 and then ported to Xbox in 2003. The Soldier of Fortune series was well known for its gameplay, sense of realism with the sequel being more realistic, and of course its gore. This is a game where you can shoot off limbs, blow off heads, and you can even take a knife and cut off corpses' limbs or even cut them up until they're nothing but meat or until there's nothing left at all. Kind of sad how the devs at Raven Software moved on to be an additional cog in the Call of Duty franchise because this game was ahead of its time and could have gone places. This was the last good game in the series. And I say that because there's Payback, but we're not going to talk about that. Then there's Black. That's right, Black. Probably one of the most underrated shooters published by EA at the time. The game's cutscenes were live action, which made the story feel more realistic as if you were watching a movie. The gameplay itself is still amazing even today. The guns used in this game do a shit ton of damage and you can see the impact of the shots on the terrain and see how it affected them. Not only that, but the amount of environmental damage you could do in this game made it really ahead of its time. And this was before Bad Company came out. The sounds the guns make are very pleasing to the ear too. In fact, I did some research and a lot of the sounds the guns make are based off of gun sounds from action films such as Die Hard, 24, and True Lies. The realism this game delivered is something I wish we could see more of in games. When your health is low enough, the screen goes black and white, your character's heartbeat gets louder, and everything goes into slow motion. And the harder the difficulty of the game, the tougher the enemies and the more objectives you need to complete. This is a game where shooting a gun feels really nice. Now I know I've talked a lot about first-person shooters so far, so I'll add one more since this is one of my favorite series. Return to Castle Wolfenstein. Now I loved playing Wolfenstein 3D as a kid, and when I got older I loved this series even more, especially where it's going today. My buddy Talon introduced me to Return to Castle Wolfenstein during college and got me this game as a Christmas gift. Now I've heard of Return to Castle Wolfenstein, but I didn't play it until that time, and this game is just as addicting as any other Wolfenstein game you'd expect, along with a fantastic story and a fun co-op mode. This game also had online multiplayer, which from what I heard was also a hit back then.
Okay, I think I've talked enough about first-person shooters for now, but you know, the Xbox was a well-known console for shooter games, but even then, it still had a lot of great games of different genres.
Back in Georgia, my friends, my sister, and I were big fans of Tim Burton's The Nightmare Before Christmas, and one of the games we loved playing as kids was Tim Burton's The Nightmare Before Christmas Oogie's Revenge, which acts as a sequel to the movie. This game plays very similarly to Devil May Cry, but is more simplistic for kids. So while everyone else at the time was playing Devil May Cry on the PS2, I was playing Oogie's Revenge. You fight against different enemies who act as Oogie's minions, and you get to interact with characters and visit areas that you saw throughout the movie. You also get different abilities and special upgrades and different outfits with different abilities. And every boss fight is a musical with new songs for the game and even songs from the movie as well. If you love Nightmare Before Christmas or even Tim Burton's films, I would definitely recommend this game if you haven't tried it out yet. Another game series I had fond memories of as a kid was Ty the Tasmanian Tiger and its sequels, except for the fourth game, which I never played. These were some fun platforming action games where you play as a Tasmanian tiger in Australia fighting against series main antagonist Boss Cass. With the use of different boomerangs with different abilities, goofy enemies to fight, mini-games to play, vehicles to pilot including the Bunyips, mechs with different uses and abilities adding more to the game. Ty the Tasmanian Tiger is definitely a hidden gem, and I'm glad the series has such a following where it has gained enough recognition for the first and second game to be released on modern day consoles with an HD makeover. Hopefully the third game will receive that same love one day. Then we have Shenmue II, the sequel to the original Dreamcast game. Now the sequel was released on Dreamcast in Japan and Europe but never made its way to the West. However, Microsoft managed to strike a console exclusivity deal for an enhanced Xbox exclusive port in North America. Now if you're a fan of adventure games with stories that will keep you attached all the way through, this is the game for you. Continuing after the first game, the player will once again be put into the shoes of protagonist Ryu Hazuki, who continues to find his father's killer. The game is definitely something to get hooked on, and even if you haven't played either game yet, it's available in an HD collection for Xbox One and PS4. The original Xbox version even comes with the movie, which is also really cool. Another game with a cult following was Destroy All Humans and Destroy All Humans 2. These were games that my sister and I spent so much time playing when we were kids. A game where you played as an alien known as a Furon named Cryptosporidium, guided by Furon scientist Orthopox. Crypto must travel throughout America to harvest human brains, which are said to hold hidden Furon DNA, which can prevent their race from extinction. Crypto does his mission with the use of his flying saucer and an abundance of different weapons and powers such as telekinesis and mind control while fighting against Majestic, a secret government agency professionalizing in studying extraterrestrial life. The story would continue in Destroy All Humans 2, taking place in the 60s and offering a whole abundance of new weapons and abilities. You even travel to other parts of the world such as the United Kingdom, Japan, Russia, and even the moon. I haven't played any of the Destroy All Humans games after the second one, but from what I heard they started to lack what 1 and 2 had, and thanks to the huge following this series had, the first game got a remake released last year, and believe it or not, a remake of the second game was just recently announced. Moving on to platformers, we've got SpongeBob Squarepants, Battle for Bikini Bottom. I loved SpongeBob as a kid, and this was a game I spent so much time on during spring break of 2004. The fun platforming, the level design, the characters, and even the charm this game delivered was something that kids who loved watching SpongeBob really appreciated. This game even got the remastered love last year with Battle for Bikini Bottom rehydrated. Speaking of platformers, we've got Crash Bandicoot, The Wrath of Cortex. Crash and Spyro were games I loved playing as a kid on the PlayStation 1, and Wrath of Cortex was no exception. A lot of things that made Crash special were there. The platforming, the humor, everything. It was Crash Bandicoot on a new generation. This was a game I loved playing as a kid, and I still love playing it today. The game's antagonists, which are the environmental tiki masks, offer variety when it comes to its levels and even their bosses. Some of them are even voiced by big-name actors such as Mark Hamill and even the late R. Lee Ermey. So imagine watching the first 15 to 20 minutes of Full Metal Jacket with Ermey cursing up a storm and then hearing him in a kid's game.
They're gonna have to hang you out to dry when I get through with you!
Next is Spyro, A Hero's Tale, the last Spyro game I played before the Reignited trilogy. A Hero's Tale was the 5th main game in the series after Enter the Dragonfly, a new adventure for the Purple Dragon featuring a new antagonist, Red the Fallen Dragon Elder, seeking revenge for his banishment by planting dark gems in the Dragon Realms to corrupt them. With new realms to explore, new enemies to fight, and even new breath abilities, this game definitely still had the charm Spyro always had. The game also also features characters from previous games returning for this game, such as Nasty Nork, the antagonist from the first game, and even returning supporting characters from previous games such as Hunter, Sergeant Bird, Sparks, and even Moneybags, although he's not much of a supporting character and still the same greedy douchebag he's always been. It even has new characters such as Blink, the nephew of the professor. What also made this game cool was, aside from Spyro, you also got to play as the supporting characters I mentioned with their own unique abilities and levels. Talk about a variety in gameplay. Now, I missed out on the Legend of Spyro series back then, and I've heard great things about it, but honestly, if A Hero's Tale was the last game in the series or the last game I ever played, I feel like I would be satisfied enough. Then we've got Psychonauts, a game from the mind of Tim Schafer. This was a game I played as a kid but never actually completed until recently. The art style and character designs are weird as hell and look like something from a Mad magazine, but that's what made it special. What made it even wacky are the level designs. You go into every person's mind and each has their own unique mentality and enemies to face and puzzles to solve in order to complete them. It does a really good job with showing the backstories of a majority of these characters and how traumatic experiences from their past affected them mentally, whether it has to do with depression, loss, or mental health. It even includes famous voice actors such as Richard Stephen Horvitz, who plays as the game's protagonist Rasputin, and even Stephen J. Bloom. A long-requested sequel to the game was recently released a couple months back thanks to popular demand, and this game definitely deserved one. Next up is Sonic Heroes, the first multi-platform Sonic game in the series. After the commercial failure and discontinuation of the Dreamcast in 2001, Sega then switched over to becoming a third-party company, and instead of making consoles exclusively for their games, they made games for the respective consoles made by Microsoft, Sony, and even Nintendo, who at one point were their rivals back in the 90s. A lot of you may laugh at me for saying this, but this was the first ever Sonic game I played in my life. I watched the cartoons and read the Archie comics as a kid before playing Sonic Heroes, but this game is what got me completely hooked on the Blue Blurs games. Although I did play the GameCube enhanced ports of the Adventure series with my friends back in Georgia after playing Heroes. I love the fact that you got to play as different teams and see their stories. And even though Heroes is considered a mixed bag to the fandom, it's still special to me as it not only got me hooked on the video game series, but also introduced me to a lot of my favorite characters, such as Shadow, Omega, Metal Sonic, and even Team Chaotix.
Yes, I like Team Chaotix. Fight me in Sonic the Fighters.
But then that fun ended with Shadow the Hedgehog, probably one of my least favorite Sonic games in the franchise. This was around the time when Shadow became a popular character thanks to Adventure 2 and his return in Heroes. Sega tried to go in a completely different direction by having a morality system where Shadow can be good, evil, or even neutral. But at the same time, they were trying to give it a darker tone compared to other Sonic games and making it edgy by giving you the option to use guns, have curse words which felt forced, drive vehicles which were slower than Shadow, and some really stupid endings depending on the path you take. If I ever get around to looking at this game, I'll go more into detail about it. Up next, we are veering into fighting game territory, and the Xbox was definitely one of the best systems for fighting games. Now, aside from games like Dead or Alive and Budokai 3, my friends and I had a blast playing Mortal Kombat Deception, the second game in Midway's trilogy of the 6th generation. Now, I loved playing the original Mortal Kombat arcade games back when I was a kid, and with its addictive fighting and violence, I didn't think it would get any better than this. Oh, but it did, because one night during a sleepover when my friends and I played this game, we were astounded. The graphics were amazing and it had everything that made Mortal Kombat special. The fighting, the blood, the fatalities were still as gruesome as ever. The game played in 3D rather than 2D, and you can even do environmental attacks and executions. The story was also really interesting too, and was the way to unlock stuff along with the crypt. I played Deadly Alliance and Armageddon later on in my life, and even then, Mortal Kombat Deception still remains as my favorite Mortal Kombat in the series next to Mortal Kombat 2. Then we have Soul Calibur 2. When going from the Dreamcast to the next generation, Soul Calibur 2 definitely still had that special arcade game feel to it, especially on console. There was a variety of characters added to it, and with the use of the Xbox controller, or at least controls with more face buttons and analogs, it made it a better experience to play. Now, Soul Calibur has always been known for having licensed guest characters in each of their games, and 2 was definitely no exception at the time. The funny thing about 2 though is that depending on what platform you get the game on, you get a guest character exclusive to the platform. GameCube had Link from The Legend of Zelda, PlayStation 2 had Heihachi from Tekken, talk about a big crossover, and Xbox had Spawn from Todd McFarlane's comic series of the same name. As much as I love Spawn and he's a fun character to play as in this game, I always found it weird that he was the Xbox exclusive character considering that the other 2 were from games made for the respective consoles at the time. I then found out the reason behind this game game was because Todd McFarlane and Namco made an agreement for the production of Soul Calibur themed resin figures. Back when I was a kid, my friends and I were also fans of monster movies and kaiju films, and that included Toho's Godzilla films. Now, aside from playing Destroy All Monsters Melee on the GameCube with my friends back then, we also had fun playing Save the Earth on the Xbox. I rented this game all the time at Blockbuster, and this was a game we played every time we decided to have a kaiju movie night during the summer. It had a majority of fan-favorite characters such as both the 90s and 2000s Godzillas, King Ghidorah, Mechagodzilla, Mothra, Destroyer, and even Jet Jaguar, and more. The characters have a variety of different moves and abilities, and even had some fun minigames. If only the angry video game nerd had these games when he was a kid. But there were also some bad fighting games like Kabuki Warriors, and oh god do I hate this game. The theme of the game revolves around Kabuki theater, a form of dance drama theater famous in Japan revolving flamboyant costumes and kumadori makeup. I learned about Japanese theater back in college, and it was nothing like what this game shows. I mean, just look at it. First off, it's ugly as sin. It looks like a bad Dreamcast game in its alpha stage. The character models are bland and fugly as hell, no personality to them whatsoever. The AI sucks, the soundtrack is forgettable, the sounds are annoying, and there's little to no variety in the moveset. I kid you not, I don't think I've ever played a fighting game with a moveset as lazy as this. There's no unique combos or chemistry, and the worst part, every character has the same moveset. You can win just by mashing the same attack button over and over again. You know a fighting game is bad when all you have to do is continually mash the same button in order to win. I suck at fighting games, and I still wouldn't even recommend this game to play with my friends, not even for an easy win. Now let's talk about something else. The 6th generation of gaming was a generation that had a lot of compilations of classic arcade and retro titles. Atari did it, Taito did it, even Namco did it. Capcom was no stranger either, with Capcom Classics Collections Volumes 1 and 2. These games included many of their classics from the past, such as Street Fighter II, Ghosts and Goblins, Bionic Commando, Section Z, Strider, Knights of the Round, and Magic Sword. While Capcom continues to release compilations of its classic lineup of games today, it's still always nice when you get to play blasts from the past on modern day consoles you own, especially if you never played them before. Speaking of classics, let's look at Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2 Battle Nexus. Now, I sadly don't own the first or third game, but I have more memories with the second game. As a kid, I loved the Ninja Turtles and enjoyed watching reruns of the original 80s cartoon, the movies, and even the 2003 series that was on Foxbox and Cartoon Network. This was one of the many beat-em-up games I played with my friends as a kid, and to me, it's still one of the most fun TMNT games I've ever played. Each turtle has their own variety of attacks, you fight against famous enemies from the show, and you can even unlock the original arcade game. In addition to childhood favorites, I thought I'd add Ed and Eddie the Misadventures into the mix. Now, if you've seen my Let's Look At of this game, you know that I talked about how this was my favorite cartoon as a kid, and I enjoyed playing this game. That feeling when you're actually in the world of Ed and Eddie is something we all dreamed of as kids back then, and this game was honestly the best way to do it. Looking back at it, I think I was a bit too nice and biased when I looked at this game, but despite its flaws, it's still a fun game. Now I thought I'd share a few horror games into the mix. We are veering into the territories of my teenage years and early college years now. First off is The Suffering and its sequel, Ties That Bind. These games have become huge cult classics for horror fans over the years. You play as Torque, a prisoner who, despite having no memory of the event, was thrown in jail for the murder of his wife and children and sentenced to death row. However, things start to take a turn for the worse when supernatural monsters known as malefactors start to overtake the prison and kill everyone in it. The Suffering was a blend of action and horror and had a similar feel to Evil Dead. Although some may argue that this didn't mix well, there were others that thought it was a nice change. The different terrifying creatures and creepy environment was enough to make you feel uneasy. There's also a lot of psychological horror thrown into the mix and offering answers to Torque's past. The biggest thing about this game was its morality level. Depending on certain actions you do, good or bad, it affects Torque's morality and in turn affects not only Torque's appearance, but also the ending of the game. The story would continue in its sequel, Ties That Bind. Now, a cool feature in this game is that you can actually transfer your data from the first game to the sequel, and depending on what ending you get in the first game, you get a different beginning and reaction system that connects with the first game's ending, and in addition, your morality stays the same as it did in the first game. Speaking of morality, they've also put more into that mechanic with how it affects even gameplay. Insanity meter that was in the first game returns but is affected depending on your morality. If you're neutral, you're basically the same creature you were from the first game, but if you're good or evil, you get different abilities, and it even affects your appearance entirely, making you look like either a beast with your humanity intact or an evil creature with no moral compass. This is a series I would love to see a revival of one day. Next we have Call of Cthulhu: Dark Corners of the Earth. A game based on the works of H.P. Lovecraft, Call of Cthulhu puts you in the shoes of Detective Jack Walters, investigating a mysterious town known as Innsmouth, with locals not taking too kindly to outsiders, in addition to fighting against enemies being part of a cult worshipping deities such as Dagon, Mother Hydra, and the Great Old One, Cthulhu. If you're a fan of horror games or even H.P. Lovecraft, this is a great telling based off of his stories. This horror game is also unique in its gameplay, where the first quarter of the game makes you rely on stealth, but even when you get a gun, you don't get a heads-up display like you do in games like Halo. You have to keep track of your ammo in addition to your health, which you have to monitor and check constantly, as it can affect gameplay and even your sanity on certain occasions. The Xbox version of this game is pretty expensive now, but the game is available on Steam for cheap if you want to play it that way, but Xbox collectors, this is a gem. Next is a game that's pretty obscure, and I mean that figuratively and literally. Probably regarded as one of the most underrated horror games ever released, Obscure is a game that practically honors the spirit of classic 80s and 90s horror teen movies in the form of a video game. Playing the theme revolving around a missing person, Obscure is definitely a game to play if you love horror games, implying you'd be willing to spend an arm and a leg on it. I'd talk more about this game, but I'd rather keep it short and sweet because this is something you should experience yourself. And of course, I can't forget about Silent Hill 2, one of my favorite horror games of all time from one of my favorite horror franchises of all time. Originally released for the PS2, the Xbox version was released a few months later and included extra content and other enhancements. Even if you haven't played the first game, Silent Hill 2 is still a great game to play, and even a great game to start with if you want to get into the series. You play as a different character in a different setting, and just like the first Silent Hill, focuses on psychological horror and messes with the psyche of the character. You even get to explore the lore of Silent Hill as well. Just like with Obscure, Silent Hill 2 is a game that should be talked about so you can experience it for yourself. Now moving on from the horror area, let's focus on some stealth games. During my teenage years, I really enjoyed playing Splinter Cell. The Splinter Cell games were endorsed by the late Tom Clancy, a novelist who was known for stories revolving around military science and espionage. The Splinter Cell games were definitely games that catered to espionage really well. The mechanics and gameplay revolving around stealth were pretty well known at the time and are still well known today. With all of its sequels, Splinter Cell is still regarded as one of the best known stealth game series next to Metal Gear. Speaking of stealth games, here are a couple of games that fans of these series tend to forget that it was on Xbox at one point: Tenchu, Return from Darkness, and Metal Gear Solid 2. I thought I'd bring these games up since, like I said, people tend to forget that they were on the OG Xbox. Now I love Tenchu, and Return from Darkness is actually an Xbox port of Wrath of Heaven, the third game in the series, and came out a week after the PS2 version. It included more content and even online play through Xbox Live. Metal Gear Solid 2 Substance was an Xbox port that came out the same year as Sons of Liberty and was an expanded edition of the game and included more content. It's nice that these games got the Xbox treatment for people who didn't own a PS2 back then. There were also some sports games that we played during these times too. When I was a kid, although I enjoyed playing basketball and backyard football with my friends, I wasn't super into sports. I also didn't play games like Madden and NBA, but we did still enjoy some sports games. One of them being SSX on Tour. Now the only other SSX games I played was SSX Tricky and the Xbox 360 reboot game from 2012. But On Tour was a lot of fun. All the grinding and tricks you can do really made it addicting. What was also cool is that you could use the triggers to knock other skiers and snowboarders off their feet, and it was hilarious. The soundtrack in the game was awesome too, with the intro song being Iron Maiden's Run to the Hills. You can't get any more badass than that. Another sports game I enjoyed playing as a kid was Tony Hawk's Project 8. Now although I was never into skateboarding, I loved Tony Hawk as a kid. I played the fuck out of Pro Skater 1 and 2 on the PS1 with my friends and rented Pro Skater 2X on the Xbox from Blockbuster from time to time, and I also enjoyed Underground 1 and 2. Never played American Wasteland though, sadly. I should pick that up sometime. Project 8 was the last Tony Hawk game I played before I stopped playing the series. It pretty much had what you would expect from a Tony Hawk game: the tricks, the cool objectives, the unlockable playable characters, and a lot of other things. Tony Hawk was an icon back in the day, and even though he's retired now, I'm glad that they continued his legacy of being a pro skater with the remastered collection of Pro Skater 1 and 2. Now on to fictional sports games with Harry Potter Quidditch World Cup. Now as a kid, I grew up reading Harry Potter and watching the movies, and I even loved playing the video games. If you're looking for a proper Quidditch simulator, then this is the game for you. You can play as any of the 4 houses, and you've got all the positions such as Chaser, the Seeker, the Beater, and even the Keeper. There's so many things to unlock and even more teams to play on when you reach the Quidditch World Cup. This game can get really competitive when you play with friends too. Weekends and summer vacations were all about RPGs back when I was a preteen. Star Wars Knights of the Old Republics 1 and 2 are regarded as some of the best Star Wars games ever made. Taking place thousands of years before the events of the movies, not including the sequel trilogy, Knights of the Old Republic focused on a completely different era in the Star Wars universe, with different characters and a conflict between the Sith and the Jedi Order, along with the lore involving the Mandalorian Wars. In the first game, you got to experience familiar planets along with new ones, and depending on your actions throughout the story, affect your morality and even the story itself. The game mechanics themselves work somewhat similar to D&D. You can choose the type of character and class that you want to be, and throughout the game make and upgrade your own build for your character and even your party. Not only that, but you had access to light side and dark side powers, adding variety and even replay value to the game. This game also introduced new characters who would later in the future become fan favorites, such as Darth Revan, Darth Malak, and even Bastila Shan. In its sequel, Knights of the Old Republic 2, The Sith Lords, where you play as a former Jedi exiled from the Jedi Order, you are on the run from the Sith and a criminal organization known as the Exchange, and with your crew must travel throughout the galaxy together to find the surviving Jedi Masters and stop the Sith once and for all. Although the sequel had different characters and completely new areas to explore, it followed pretty much the same gameplay formula as the first game, although slightly altered in some cases, and also has light side or dark side powers, and depending on your actions and morality, can affect your party member. Jade Empire was a game I eventually picked up during high school. This game was developed by BioWare, who also developed the first Knights of the Old Republic game. Although more linear than the latter, Jade Empire basically has a lot of the things Knights of the Old Republic has. Morality-based dialogue, different character archetypes with different stats, and different allies to help you on your journey. The game also plays differently as well compared to KOTOR, where the combat is in real time and each character archetype you choose to play has different strengths, weaknesses, and even at times abilities. The world in this game was also inspired by Chinese mythology and even has music and lore based off of Chinese culture and folklore. If you like Knights of the Old Republic or even Chinese mythology and culture, you'll probably like this game. Then we've got Elder Scrolls 3 Morrowind, which I picked up during my freshman year of college. Now I just want to clarify that Skyrim was the first game I ever played in the Elder Scrolls series during my teenage years. Ever since then, I have wanted to play the previous games. When I played Oblivion and Morrowind later on, I realized how different they were compared to Skyrim. Oblivion ran on the same engine as Fallout 3, a game I played before Oblivion, and Morrowind truly was something different. If you're already so used to Skyrim, you're going to have a hard time adjusting to Morrowind. There's a lot more complex RPG mechanics that were common for games like this at the time. There's no waypoints, so you have to use your journal and map to know where you need to go for your quest, and there's no travel system either, so expect a majority of your hours in this game to revolve around traveling and backtracking. And the combat system, well, it's annoying and has not aged well at all. But playing this game and giving it a chance made me appreciate older RPGs more, as they had a lot of gameplay assets and mechanics that made for a great experience, which most of those assets were omitted from the later games or even altered and made them too simplistic and way too casual friendly. And as much as I still love Skyrim, after playing Morrowind, it became my new favorite game in the Elder Scrolls series so far. Hopefully when 6 comes out, implying that it ever does, it probably won't be as good as Morrowind, but will hopefully be on the same level. And even if it isn't, who cares? I'm tired of seeing Skyrim over and over again at this point. Another RPG that I played back then was Lord of the Rings: The Third Age, and this was technically the first RPG game I ever played, but didn't know what an RPG game was at the time. Now as a kid, along with being a fan of Star Wars, I was also a big fan of Lord of the Rings, and back then my friends and I also loved playing Return of the King and The Two Towers on the PS2. While everyone else was playing Final Fantasy X at the time, I was playing The Third Age. This game had no relation to the movies and kind of did its own thing. It had turn-based JRPG elements and had other assets that JRPGs had. So although this technically isn't considered a JRPG game to a lot of people, this game in a way introduced me to the genre. Now speaking of licensed games, I also played a lot of superhero games at the time, one of them being Superman, the Man of Steel. Now although I was more of a Batman fan as a kid, I did love Superman, and one weekend when my folks and I went to Blockbuster, I saw this game on the shelf and wanted to rent it. Although I liked the game back then, that same feeling I had playing this as a kid sadly didn't stick with me in my later years. The awkward controls, the poor combat mechanics, and the horrible voice acting. This is just another example of a poor outcome in making a video game based off of one of DC's most famous superheroes. I will say this, it's better than Superman 64, you don't have to fly through rings to progress in this game. Now to switch it from the Man of Steel to the Caped Crusader, as a kid I loved watching Batman the Animated Series, and another game I enjoyed renting from Blockbuster was Batman Vengeance. It had a really nice art style which honored the series, particularly the new Batman adventures. The game is fun and it actually makes you feel like you're in the animated series. The problems with this game is that the controls feel stiff and the mechanics to switch between gadgets just feel awkward, but overall, still a fun game nonetheless. Then there's Batman Begins, the video game based on the 2005 Christopher Nolan movie. Aside from having its own levels and areas in the game along with having levels based on scenes from the movie, the game was focused more on stealth and giving it more of a sense of realism. Guns kill you quickly, enemies can swarm up on you, and so on. You can even use the environment and your actions to influence the fear mechanic, which can make your enemies weaker. Being a movie licensed title, it's not an amazing game, but it's still decent. And now switching from DC to Marvel. Now back in the 6th generation, there were a lot of Marvel games, and as a kid, not only was I reading comics, watching the animated series, especially the 90s and early 2000s era cartoons, and watching the movies at the time, I also played quite a few video games as well. First up, but not in order, is Marvel Ultimate Alliance, a multiplayer RPG where you play as different heroes from the Marvel comic universe. Before the Disney Marvel age, there was an age where all of these heroes were together at once in multiple medias without worrying about copyright and license holding. Aside from reading comics as a kid, I got a lot of my knowledge of the Marvel Universe through this game, as there was a lot of lore and trivia for the characters and the universe. And it's what made me love Marvel and comics altogether. Kind of sad that the updated versions of this game that include more characters are no longer available after Activision lost the rights to Marvel. Then there's XMen, the official game, taking place between X2 and X3 The Last Stand. The official game puts you in the shoes of 3 characters from X2. Wolverine, who focuses on combat, Iceman, who has levels that are very flight simulator-like, and Nightcrawler, who focuses on platforming and combat. The game explains why Nightcrawler was absent in The Last Stand and even introduces Hydra. The game even showcases comic characters that weren't in the movies before this game, such as the Master Mold and the Sentinels, who appeared in X3, and the Silver Samurai. Pretty good continuation of the sequel, and really was a great way to bridge the events between X2 and X3. Would recommend looking into the game if you haven't played it yet. Then we have Hulk, the video game sequel to the 2003 movie featuring Eric Bana as Bruce Banner / Hulk. The movie takes place a few years after the film, and despite of course being a licensed superhero movie game, was still really fun. The game is linear and there's 2 different segments throughout the game. There's Hulk, which focuses on the beat-em-up sections, and then there's Banner, which focuses on stealth and puzzle solving. It also introduces characters from the comics such as Half-Life, Leader, and Madman. And then we've got the Punisher. Now, I used to watch the movies as a kid with my dad and uncle and saw him in the 90s Spider-Man cartoon and PS1 game, but I didn't get fully into the Punisher until my freshman year of high school. And as a fan of the comics, this game really does the Punisher justice. Hunting down and punishing criminals, using a variety of guns and a whole assortment of executions. The amount of violence that this game delivers is still insane even today. This is a great M-rated video game for an R-rated superhero, and I'm hoping one day we see another game like this for Frank Castle. Imagine Insomniac making a Punisher game. And now off to one of my top favorite Marvel superheroes ever since I was a kid. Spider-Man was an icon and an idol for me growing up, and he was someone who inspired me a lot. I loved reading the comics, watching the 90s series, and even the Sam Raimi movies with Tobey Maguire as the titular hero. The first ever Spider-Man game I played as a kid was the PS1 game, but then jumped to the next generation of games where we had Spider-Man 1 and 2, which were based off the Raimi films, and Ultimate Spider-Man. Spider-Man 1 was a linear game having you to go from point A to point B most of the time, or even solve puzzles in quick succession, and even has some stealth missions. It's also got some pretty addicting combat and some fun minigames. And the cool thing about this game is that some points of the game are narrated by Bruce Campbell himself, who appeared in cameos in the trilogy and previously played Ash Williams in Sam Raimi's Evil Dead. Spider-Man 2, however, was where it was at. The graphics were so much better, it introduced characters that weren't in the films, and the combat and swinging swinging mechanics got some nice upgrades and changes. In addition, it also allowed you to free roam throughout New York City and actually feel like Spider-Man, and it got even better in Ultimate Spider-Man, with similar but slightly altered mechanics and its cel-shading comic book-like style. Not only that, but you also get to play as Venom, who's been one of my favorite villains slash anti-heroes in Spider-Man ever since I was a kid. The new Spider-Man games on PS4 are the greatest Spider-Man games of the modern day of gaming, but we should never forget these gems and their place in history, and I cannot wait for Insomniac's Spider-Man 2.
Now before we get to the last batch of games, I thought I'd showcase a few more first-person shooters. I know that I already talked about a lot already, but I felt like these deserved a spot on the video too.
Up first is Doom 3, the action shooter series that pioneered the way for the future of first-person shooters stepped into the shadows of horror with its third entry in the series. First released on PC in 2004 and then on Xbox a year later, Doom 3 was known for being different from the previous games, and while that the previous entries were fast-paced action shooters where you kill everything on sight, Doom 3 forced you to tread lightly and preserve your ammo. The game was also really dark in a lot of areas, forcing you to use your flashlight to make it easier to see. But you couldn't use your weapon and flashlight at the same time, so you had to constantly switch between them whenever enemies are nearby. The game's story would continue in its standalone expansion, Doom 3: Resurrection of Evil, which had an all-new story and was more focused on action rather than horror, although the horror elements were still there. And while Doom went back to its action-orientated, gut-ripping roots in Bethesda's reboot series, it was still a nice idea for the series to take a different route at the time. Next is 13, another cult classic shooter which was known for its cel-shading, comic book-like action mechanics and story. You play as an agent afflicted with amnesia while fighting against a mercenary organization trying to hunt you down and kill you. This game was inspired by spy films such as the James Bond movies, and even had some famous actors voicing for characters such as the late Adam West and David Duchovny voicing the titular character. This game would get a remake which released last year, but from what I heard, it did not do so well. Sometimes it's best to stick with the original. Finally, there's Darkwatch, which I like to think of as Western Gothic Halo, many regarding it as a Halo clone. You play as a vampiric outlaw with the spirit of a vampire hunter within you acting as your Cortana for the game. The game had a very unique story, addicting gameplay, and was something I wish would have gotten a sequel. If you didn't have an Xbox to play Halo at the time, this was the best backup. Now for the final batch of games, Star Wars games. Now although the PlayStation 2 and GameCube had their own exclusive Star Wars games such as Super Bombad Racing, the Rogue Squadron sequels for the GameCube, Force Unleashed with the PS2 version being the only 6th-gen console was released on, and even Bounty Hunter, which was available on both of those consoles. This is going to make me sound biased, but Xbox was definitely the place for Star Wars games. Now I already talked about Knights of the Old Republic and how it's well known in the Star Wars gaming community. You've got Star Wars Republic Commando, a first-person shooter game where you play as a clone commando leading your own squad with the use of squad team tactics. You fight against many different enemies such as droids, Trandoshan mercenaries, Geonosians, and more, with the use of a different variety of your weapons. In addition, your whole squad is a weapon, where you can provide them orders to breach a door, attack a certain enemy, and so on. After all these years, this game still looks visually pleasing. And then there's the Jedi Knight games. Jedi Knight 2 Jedi Outcast continues the story of Kyle Katarn, the protagonist of Dark Forces and Dark Forces 2. In the first part of the game, you rely on firearms and platforming to get by. In the second half, you finally get a lightsaber, and that's where the fun begins. The controls, the use of force powers, and variety in gameplay along with its story make this game another one of the most well-known Star Wars games. But honestly, I find its sequel, Jedi Knight Jedi Academy, much better. You play as a new protagonist, Jade Empire, who you can customize in the beginning. This game not only delivers more abilities, but also has light side and dark side powers where you can choose one or the other or balance them out. You can also get either a double-bladed saber or you can dual wield. This game to this day still has some of the best lightsaber combat I've ever seen in any Star Wars game. Next we've got Star Wars Starfighter Special Edition. Taking place before the Battle of Naboo and the Phantom Menace, Starfighter has players play as several different pilots with different unique starfighters. The story itself is really fleshed out too, and you can actually connect with the characters. The game was first released on February 2001 for PS2, and the Xbox version was released months later subtitled Special Edition, including some graphical enhancements and loads of additional content the PS2 version didn't have. The special edition of this game is the best version to play for the best experience. Plus, the green theme of the special edition fits well on the black label cover for the Xbox. And then we have Star Wars Battlefront 1 and 2, the original games developed by Pandemic Studios. As much as I love the newer Battlefronts by EA, the original games will always be special. You get to choose your map and decide which era to be a part of in addition to which side you wanted to be on. You can ride vehicles, choose classes, and have a blast. You feel like you're in an actual battle in the Star Wars universe, and it got even better with its sequel, which added more maps, more vehicles, and more game modes. You can also play as the heroes and villains from the prequel and original trilogy, and to top it all off, it also included space battles, allowing you to pilot many iconic starfighters, and you can even invade the enemy's capital ships. These games have definitely aged well. And then there's the Revenge of the Sith video game. Although the graphics haven't aged well, it's still actually a pretty fun action game. You switch between Anakin and Obi-Wan, playing levels that extend scenes from the movies. There's even challenge modes and a versus mode. And then of course there's LEGO Star Wars and LEGO Star Wars 2, the original trilogy. Now LEGO games have basically become a staple and practically its own genre at this point, and have improved quite a lot over the years. LEGO Star Wars is what started it all. This was way before they added voice acting, way before they added thousands of different characters, way before they changed the gameplay mechanics, and it was much simpler back then. You got to play through the prequel trilogy in LEGO form, and what this game was well known for was its humor and fun. That would continue in its sequel, the original trilogy, which as the name suggests, allow you to play through the original film trilogy and adding more characters to play as and other fun stuff. And pretty soon we'll get a chance to relive it in a new era through the Skywalker saga. My, how time has flown by. Now the last game I'm going to talk about is another bad game, and one from the Star Wars game lineup. Star Wars Obi-Wan, and this has to be one of the worst Star Wars games I ever played in my life. The horrible voice acting, the weird use of the right thumbstick to do lightsaber combat, the ugly graphics and level design. This game is just so boring. This was a game that took place during the events of the Phantom Menace. I'm sorry, but I don't care if there's extended lore in this game, even though nowadays it's not canon. I'd rather watch the fucking movie. If you want to see how bad it is, check out the playthrough my friends and I did on the Ada Slide channel.
Okay, I think I'm about ready to wrap this whole thing up, but you know, it was really nice to go back and look at some of the games, or pretty much all the games that I enjoyed playing when I was a kid. I know that I made this video a little bit longer than necessary, but there's a reason why I did that. One reason is because aside from the Super Nintendo, the Xbox was the main console that I grew up with. Another reason is because the 6th generation really was a special generation for all of us. It really defined the hardware capabilities and variety of games for each console, and most of them would continue later on today. The Xbox truly was a powerhouse of a console at the time. Its hardware capabilities allowed most games to run smoother on the system, and some games, particularly exclusives, tested the limits of the console's hardware and still managed to run very well, like Ninja Gaiden Black. Its PC hardware also allowed it to play many games that were originally on PC, and some were a bit demanding on the console but still played fairly well. What was also cool was that you could copy music soundtracks from CDs to the console, and some games allowed custom soundtracks. Have the Halo 2 soundtrack? Copy it into the system, and now you have the Halo 2 soundtrack when you play games that have a custom soundtrack option like Black. Not only that, but the Xbox was also known for its online service, Xbox Live. Lots of games were played online through multiplayer and developed fan followings, especially Halo 2, which at the time was considered the best multiplayer shooter for the Xbox and even made it into the competitive shooter scene back in the day. Not only that, but you could purchase DLCs for a lot of these games. That's right, lots of people nowadays may not know this or even remember this, but the Xbox also had downloadable content for a majority of these games too. These range from map packs to extra characters to story expansions and extra levels and more. The Dreamcast was technically the first console to implement online capabilities and even have DLC, although it was very limited because of hardware and internet limitations. But Xbox was the console that popularized the concept of what the Dreamcast had. And although Xbox Live on the OG Xbox sadly shut down in 2009, that didn't stop fans from keeping the online multiplayer following on the console alive thanks to X-Link Kai, which allows people to play online with System Link. Many old school fans to this day still play Halo 2's online multiplayer along with other games on the OG Xbox with this software. And look at how far
Xbox has gone these past few generations. Nowadays, on the current generation of Xbox, you can stream movies and shows, play Blu-rays, and even live stream games through the console without the use of capture software. Speaking of games, you don't even need to have the disc anymore if you don't want to. You can just buy them digitally on the Microsoft Store and download them to the console. And there's even automatic cloud saves when you transfer to a new console, and even crossplay and cross-buy between Xbox and PC. And I can't forget the Game Pass subscription and its ultimate variation, allowing you to download and play any game available in the service as long as you're subscribed to it. This is exactly why they call it Netflix for video games. And of course, we can't forget backwards compatibility. The 360 tried it out at first and it did pretty well despite some setbacks, but it got so much better on the Xbox One when backwards compatibility returned, and even better on the Series X/S. Not only that, but a lot of these previous generation games can be graphically upscaled on the new consoles to look so much better than it did before. The fact that you can play 3 previous generations of Xbox in addition to current generation Xbox games on the Series X is amazing. And in this current generation, the Series X and S are the only consoles that support full backwards compatibility spanning throughout all generations. I know it doesn't have every game, but the point is they have all generations. Hopefully Microsoft will continue adding to the list of backwards compatible titles, but even then, I'm looking forward to the new games they'll be releasing in the coming years. I'm excited for Halo Infinite, and I'm especially excited for other upcoming exclusive titles under their partnership with Bethesda and other devs. I know I neglected to mention a bunch of other games in this video that were popular on the Xbox and even terrible on the Xbox, but the main reason I did, in addition to neglecting the ones I own in my collection, is either because I either haven't played them, I don't own them, and because I felt like this video went on longer than it needed to. And I also wanted to talk about the games that were important to me, in addition to shouting out games that deserve to be looked back on or looked at for people who were not familiar with them. There'll be plenty of time for that in future videos. Happy 20th birthday, Xbox. God, I feel so old.
Well, that was a nice trip down memory lane, and I'm glad I got to use this opportunity to test out my new capture device. I know I don't really do a lot of content on this channel, and I'm sorry about that, but at the end of the day, this is just a hobby for me. Now, I think I'm going to enjoy my nice winter vacation, it's the holidays, and I'm going to relax. And I hope you guys do that too. So, until next time, I'm Shane. Hope you all have a happy holidays, happy 20th birthday, Xbox and Halo, and I'll see you guys next time. Until then, I shall wait for Infinite's release day.